right, good morning again. David Santiago, Principal Technical Artist at Insomniac Games. Working with procedural systems, pipeline, and tools. Starting to integrate more of this stuff into our tools so even more artists and designers can use it. For this talk, I really just wanted any questions that you have about anything. Otherwise, I'll kind of just run through the different procedural systems that we used on Spider-Man, and I mean, just through the whole thing, just because I don't have anything in specific I need to say about anything, but I can just talk, really. So we did a lot of stuff, so there's a lot that we can talk about. I want to thank Insomniac Games. We're hiring. We use Houdini on all of our projects now. And the first Magic Leap title, actually available on sale, used Houdini at least to make these badges, if you recognize that that stuff. And maybe someone will speak about that at some point. It's also being used in Stormland, Oculus VR title, which is being demoed at Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, I think still today. And I'm not sure when that comes out. But it was definitely used for Spider-Man. And there are a lot of GDC talks about Spider-Man. These are the ones that actually mentioned Houdini use, our procedural systems. And there's X-Ray, a big Houdini user there. These are more talks with mention Houdini. And then that was my talk yesterday. So I need to thank Marvel Games and Sony Interactive Entertainment, for letting me do this and having us make the game for them. All right, so has everybody seen parts of Spider-Man at least? Played it? Who hasn't played it? That's okay. I probably haven't played your games either. I don't really play many games, so I like making them. So I could show a little bit of video. So pretty much the open world of the Spider-Man was at least initially procedurally generated. So the ground, buildings, placing all the trees, all the props, creating the traffic network, the pedestrian network, all sorts of things. Placing the crimes, placing vignettes. So if you say there's an accident or people being arrested, those are little vignettes that they turn on and off at different times. The markup that Spider-Man uses to swing for his traversal, that's all procedurally placed based on buildings and other things. All right, so I'll just give you an overview of all the different procedural systems. So the ground system, streets, sidewalks, gray spaces, all generated procedurally. That's pretty much the majority of the procedural modeling is the ground. There were a few other things that are procedurally modeled, but the ground is a completely procedural thing that's in the game. The buildings, we instance models from building kits. Do procedural systems for the traffic, again, pedestrian vehicle traffic, placing crimes and vignettes, placing props, generating impostors, and more. So I will go over our plan. Here's Manhattan. So the ground for Manhattan is generated by defining roads and alleys. So once those roads and alleys are placed, and let's just assume they're placed and done, but if you went to my talk yesterday, you know that they weren't done until very late in production. So the Houdini system pretty much for this makes roads kind of just like you can in the game tools now. I think the game tool stuff came from what I started on Sunset Overdrive. And Unfortunately, I could not use the game tools to do my roads because I was doing some different things. So just from these curves, those curves, they just have the information that say the street width and the road size and the curb height and the lane configuration. And then it could go through and generate the street and the sidewalks and the gray spaces where the blocks are for the buildings. And also in conjunction with this was a ground modifier zone. And these additional curves and volumes, they would allow you to cut holes in the ground or put dents in the ground or change materials or do any other sorts of stuff to the ground itself. And then it would generate the ground. Yes?
Yeah. How much of those initial roads were seeded from hand drawing based on looking at a map versus was there anything to digest the data from?
Yes.
Like actual city data or?
Not actual city data, but there was a map that was drawn by the designers, and they drew several maps. It was in Illustrator, and the very first version was in images that were ingested by Houdini, and I would read that image and I would generate where the streets were and then they were color coded for building sizes, and I would do for varieties of sizes. So then I would put in buildings for that, and then design would play through, and just with the block stuff, they would play through. And then once we got to like, okay, this is starting to feel good, then I just turned that stuff so there was just primitives and curves in the editor, and then no more image processing with Houdini anymore, because it just didn't make sense, because we're going to be authoring everything in the editor after that. So there was just probably a couple months where I was, reading those images and generating those block outs for the designers before. As soon as it was in the editor and they were using moving curves, then I was already starting to procedurally make the buildings with their instances and stuff. So, yeah.
How did you resolve road intersections, specifically intersections of roads of different width? Do you use any custom geometry or modular pieces?
No, everything is custom. So all of the roads are organic and custom, and it's just, so you pretty much take those curves and you sweep along them with a line of the right width, and then you end up with all these polygons all over, and then you kind of stitch those together into just the strips of road including the intersection geometry, right? So it's essentially, you're kind of like you're taking the block inside of inside of the sidewalk block, and you take those and you can just pretty much cut holes through a big grid, and that'll leave you with the streets, sidewalks and the streets. And then as far as what part about handling the intersections, the shapes, or yours is just about making the streets in the first place, not like UV's question or anything. I can talk about that as well.
Yeah, UVs as well.
Okay, so for the streets themselves, based on lane configuration and such, along the straight sections of the streets, they actually were UV'd and had a bunch of vertex colors driving things like puddles and things like that. Puddles where things like that were procedurally vertex painted in the model to reveal that stuff in the materials. And then in the intersections, because all of a sudden you have all these roads crossing each other, well, what are your UVs going to be like? So we actually just transition just to a world space material. Under the crosswalk is where that transition happens. And then we transition to a world space material in the intersection. So we do have, we do have a way to decide, and we want to say, I want this street to be the dominant one and it to maintain its UVs across an intersection. But that only works on a four-way intersection. We have a lot of 5 and 6 and crazy ones. So in a couple cases, we did maintain, because of some skid marks and things that we want to preserve through an intersection, we just maintain a dominant one. But in most of them, it goes to a world space material in the intersections. Also, in every single district has different materials for the streets and for the sidewalks. And since tiles span different districts, that means that each of those has to be cut up in the different pieces where it would decide. And you don't want a street to change material right in the middle. So you kind of figure out, okay, where do I transition? Where is this block in a different district? All right. So yeah. So yes. No problem. I just really want to answer questions.
Fascinated because you said that, if I'm correct, your final street layout you didn't actually fix until quite late. Is that right?
Yeah, we locked the street layout in late January of 2018. And
but you also mentioned that I think that the procedural sort of setup of buildings and everything that's generated is kind of the basis for further work from artists. So how do you go about, artists adding kind of their own bits and pieces to the world when that world can then, the layout can change and get procedurally regenerated?
So we could tag their work in various ways. So some of it's automatically tagged by the tool saying who changed something last. And then other ways are based on just other metadata. So say like a naming convention where it could tag that it was edited, but it was actually easier just to put it in different containers. So, and it was part of their workflow. That's like, oh, once I finish this goes into a group, and I know that not to edit those groups or procedurally edit those groups. Or if I need to procedurally edit around them, I will keep that group and then I'll put it back in. And then I always have override modes. So sometimes I did adjust things that were hand authored procedurally. I readjusted them to match the ground and buildings and stuff.
Very cool, thanks.
Yeah. There was kind of possibilities to do anything. You could override anything in any scenario, which is why the networks got a little bit crazy. So pretty much for the ground, the way that the ground was solved is creating the block and then creating those road strips. And then, this was exactly how I did it on Sunset Overdrive. So if you saw that presentation, where I went to excruciating detail, it's pretty much the same. There was no elevation actually in any of the streets in Manhattan. When we got to once we had laid everything out, and we're trying to figure, all right, we wanted to put an elevation in as you were going up north towards Harlem. But then because Central Park was being done by hand and other things as far as figuring out the markup and metrics, we decided not to put any elevation in the island at all, so that we wouldn't have any integration issues later. So it's a little sad since my system can do all sorts of crazy elevation, but I actually ended up just stripping that completely out so there wouldn't accidentally get any elevation added. So when we proceed to generate the ground, all these different things like the crosswalks. So these crosswalks are actually models. They're not decals, right? Because they have to custom fit onto the streets and around the intersections. So those are Booleaned out models for every single crosswalk. And then the street lines themselves are also models with materials on them. It lowered our decal count, right? We only have a certain allocation for decals, and we want the artist to just be able to go crazy with decals. So I don't do that. I generate these models, and these models are rendered as decals. So the buildings themselves, initially I populated the world with a lot of just blocks for the designers to kind of figure out heights of buildings and what felt good swinging. And then eventually designers would go through and they did their own block out using primitives and these polyline volumes. So they could just draw polygons and then extrude them in our editor to give them height. And then stack them up like blocks like this and say, okay, this is what I want the building to be. And then to start with, they would automatically just randomly get a building kit. And we started off with the first building kit was just called the generic building kit. And that's where we established all the different pieces that could be used by the system. And then we developed, there were 5 others that matched the that matched all the metrics and had all the same pieces. And so pretty much the whole world would get populated with those 5 different architectural styles to begin with. And people could, the artist could determine to say, I want this architectural style in this building. And so as the artists went through and they would remodularize buildings, they say, oh, I'm going to change this building with different polygonal volumes. And then say, but I want this one to be, I can't remember the old-fashioned brick or whatever the different styles are. I can't remember now, it's a blur. And then it would rebuild that building for them. And then later on, they would hand modify the buildings. So they could say this building was, maybe they added all that stuff on the top. They could do anything and hand modify it. And then this procedural system would only just add the procedural markup, add the traversal markup, the swing hint volumes, that if you went to Doug's talk today about traversal and swing and how they do the swinging mechanics, that's what it was all for. So the traffic system, so pretty much, I mean, Houdini placed all the roads, it did all the traffic, the road layouts, so it pretty much should know where the traffic is. So for the pedestrians, what it did is it put on each main centers of each sidewalk, avoiding alleys and other places, it would place volumes to populate the sidewalks with pedestrians. So that's pretty easy. You know where all the sidewalks are. Let's just put volumes are there of a certain size. We could also procedurally decide on what, based on the district, how you want it predominantly populated with, which kind of people, construction workers, whatever is going on. And then from the center of each corner, we just drew a line and we would connect the create a network of pedestrian traffic. And then, so from corner to corner and corners across the street, we created pretty much just lines. And then we would integrate any hand-drawn lines. So they were hand-drawn pedestrian paths for parks and plazas and things like that. And those would automatically connect it in the editor. So for that, the Houdini work was, all right, how do you take all these line segments that are being created, and then where they intersect, you want to create that intersection point. You want to separate segments. And then in some cases, you want to integrate segments. So with the hand group. So that's pretty much what all the processing of that Houdini did. So a lot of segment work and splitting and joining and then pretty much just kind of procedurally going through the machinations to actually instance out these particular volumes that are used to control the pedestrian traffic. And then we would actually set the different phases. So based on which way it was going on the street, east-west would have one phase, north-south, or predominantly north-south would have another phase. And that's how they would go follow the traffic signals and such. And the vehicles had a similar system with lots of volumes to populate the parking spaces. Again, Houdini, we had many different traffic layouts or different lane layouts, but we ended up using very few in the end because we just specifically wanted certain style streets and in order to control the traffic patterns better. But yeah, so it was like single lane with a parked car, two lanes, a one-way street with 2 lanes and parked cars, a two-way street, 2 lanes in one direction and 1 lane in the other, and with a parking lane, and then boulevards, which were 4 lanes of moving traffic and parked cars on either side, and then a couple others. And Houdini would choose that randomly to start with to populate all the different streets. And then at some point, the designers would say, okay, I want to stick with this particular style. So we would populate that information in the editor so they could change it in the editor and change the style. So it worked really well. We were generating traffic all over and over and over again. And integrating hand-authored stuff. It was just making the city feel alive. Then the propping system would street props, just placing asphalt patches, manhole covers, skid marks, tar. So in the street, those bus stop signs, which would get placed wherever a bus stop was placed, they're not part of that bus stop prefab. It would detect where a bus stop prefab was placed, whether it was placed procedurally or placed manually, and then it would go back and regenerate the ground and put that decal in the ground. So those, and speaking of the bus stops, those bus stops are something we call pedestrian prefabs. So it's kind of a pop, kind of a pedestrian item because there are actors associated with it. And we place those for hot dog carts, subway entrances, bus stops, sign spinners, cab hailers. And those have to be placed with particular rules, and they can actually get promoted into the pedestrian traffic system. So if all of a sudden there's a crime, they can be promoted to be running pedestrians and flee from the crime. Or if they're like waiting in line at a hot dog cart and you just stand around, people waiting in line at the hot dog cart can be promoted to leave and walk down the street. Let's see. So yes.
Question. It's kind of a question I want to ask anyway, but you touched on it. So like, when it gets regenerated, the bus stop sign appears near the bus stop.
Mm-hmm. It also makes the curb yellow.
Yeah, all that stuff.
The fire, wherever there are fire hydrants, so the fire hydrants get placed after the ground is generated, but then it has to go and regenerate the ground, painting the curbs red and such.
Yeah, so my question is more of like a overall dependency thing. Like, what was the turnaround for somebody places a bus stop? When do they see all this stuff appear? And are you constantly rebuilding all your data? Is that like a big workflow issue?
Well, yeah, we're kind of constantly rebuilding. There are people in charge of all these different systems. So like the people who kind of manage the PED prefabs, but artists can place all this stuff as well. And when they check their stuff in, there's different little tags when they check their work in that would appear to different people or to say, hey, these are all updated for these things. And then the procedural systems would run. In some cases, they had the artists themselves. We had a lot of stuff exposed in Houdini, a Houdini menu in our tools. So for generating buildings, they could regenerate their own buildings. They could regenerate their own impostors. They could redo the markup if they wanted just markup. I can't remember what all else, because we kept, throughout production, we just kept changing what was available in that menu, because at some point they shouldn't be doing certain things. They did them anyway. So it's just a lot of regeneration, and which is kind of what it ended up being everything in flux, everything in parallel, crazy dependencies. And we have to, and designing the procedural systems to handle that, to handle hand authored work and handle all the different dependencies and try to split them up.
How much was it reliant on people triggering the regeneration versus like the tool automatically knowing it needs to regenerate?
I think it was pretty much mostly people. I mean, it was just part of the process that stuff would be regenerated. So every night, pretty much every night, we would generate a new cache of data from what was checked in. So we'd have a current state of the world, and as it would reprocess. And so, I mean, as I reprocess it, I would check it. Pre-process, I would check, has our bus stop been added now? Has a subway been added now? Because when they add a subway entrance, it also has to go back and cut a hole in the ground. Or they move a subway entrance. And so I would constantly go through it and harvest the subway data, that's all in our cache. I could just go, all right, let's go, where are the subways today? Where were they yesterday? And I see, these guys have moved. I'm going to reprocess that, remove the hole from where it was, cut a hole from where it is. And yeah, it was just a lot of craziness. And if it didn't happen yet, someone would be playing the game and they're going like, I can't get in the subway entrance. And the thing is and then the traffic has to be regenerated as well and things like that. But yeah, it was pretty much we just continually reprocessed. We could regenerate actually the entire island with everything overnight. But we only did that earlier in production, because as soon as people started hand authoring stuff, it was more surgical. I mean, it's still a lot of stuff, but we weren't just gonna regenerate everything every night. Let's see. We also did lighting. We did lighting and audio. So for lighting, X-Ray had his talk yesterday as well. And For lighting, we placed lighting grids and lighting probes. Excuse me. And then we also went the lights on the street. All the street lights are all practical. And then when they said, "Hey, the alleys are kind of dark. Can we get lights in there?" Automatically went through the alleys and placed lights fixtures on the buildings in the alleys. If we couldn't find a good place to put that light fixture, I just floated it in the middle of the alley and then put a big box around it. And the lighting artist would go through and we told the lighting artist to do it, not the environment artist, because they would just go, "Oh, look at that. Why is that floating out there? Delete." So the lighting artist would go like, "Oh, there's a light I want, and I want it here." And then that's how they went through the world. And so so it was one day they said, "Wow, it's really dark in the alleys." And they came to me and said, "Hey, can you do something about that?" I go, "Okay." And the next day there was lights in the alleys. So once you know where lots of things are, it's easy to add more of these features. And then for audio, we added the reverb volumes, which is pretty much you have to figure out where the buildings are and where the open spaces are and stack these volumes based on their type. So there's a certain type of sound that's at the ground level, certain at mid-level, and certain higher levels. Eventually, those upper ones were like, well, we don't even need those because we can just kind of go with a generic thing at that height. And then we were also proceeded to place particular sound instances in different situations. So, I mean, normally, well, most stuff, it's like the sound is already built into a prefab that could be placed. But if you don't want it active everywhere and you don't want to be controlling an actor to actually have it toggle it on because you don't want to waste those cycles, then we just would kind of surgically place things. And then eventually had to create a lot of audio collision volumes, and a lot of audio collision models for Central Park. Central Park's materials kind of used a painted map in order to put the grass and the paths and everything. And our audio system just takes whatever the material audio tag is. So all of Central Park, whether you were walking on the grass or walking on the sidewalk, sounded like you were walking on grass, because that's what our default setting was for park. So I had to go through and detecting what material was on different places. From the texture, I would go through and detect what material was, and then I would generate these collision models, audio collision models that would say, nope, sound like grass here, sound like tile here, sound like asphalt here. And that was, they were very happy with that, because otherwise it has to be done by hand. Here's more propping. So this is Act 3 props. And so the dependencies, it's crazy when we're placing all this stuff. So it's a lot of chicken and the egg stuff. And so you have to kind of decide what your weighting is. So like how much do I want this to be placed? And how often do I want it to place? Is this more important than this? And then you kind of cycle through those to place everything. But then someone will move one item or decide they don't want an item, and you want to rebalance that. So here for this Act 3, for putting the garbage everywhere, the trick was you want to look like there's trash everywhere, but you also can't block any pedestrians or vehicles or missions or crimes. So the city, it looks really full, but it is very, very procedurally crafted in avoiding all of those parts of gameplay. So some areas, it's like, there's not really much trash there. And it's like, yeah, because there's a lot of gameplay that goes on there. Maybe people cleaned up in that area. They were the only people who were healthy enough to keep cleaning. I don't know. But, and then the blue, the procedurally placed puddles that have been, they wouldn't mention that at all until, I can mention it now. That so the puddles are procedurally placed just based on the random seed or the randomness in the material that decides, oh, this is going to be wet whenever it's a wet atmosphere. And so my procedural system, I actually drove it because it's my vertex color. And so I knew there was going to be a puddle there if it's going to be a wetness of a certain threshold. So I would place these puddles, and those are the puddles that when that atmosphere was active, they would have the ripples and splash and the audio. So, yes.
Yeah, so you're talking about, you obviously have a lot of very complicated dependencies. Did you ever have the issue that multiple artists would be working on features close by and they would check things in? you regenerate some of that procedurism overnight, and you end up with conflicting side effects.
With none or with conflicting side? Oh, yes, of course. So the system, as it procedurally went through, would try to assume that if it was already there, it's probably good. But first, we'll validate: is it still legal? Like, did they move something that now this can't be there? A lot of artists would also work with not all the zones on, so they wouldn't realize that they've moved something that, there's a sign spinner guy there. He's going to be spinning a sign, and you just moved a trash can where he's standing. It's like, that's why I didn't put a trash can there. So I would validate. So this pedestrian prefabs had higher priority than things like trash cans. So the system would go through, and it would, assuming everything's right, and then go through and match against the dependencies that it had in the rules, and say, why did they put that trash can there? It doesn't belong here. And then it would delete it, or move it to pretty much you want to try to move it to a proper location first. So as the system goes through, it actually calculates all the possible locations for every single item. And then it distributes based on those locations, and the next dependency does the same thing. So, if we were doing trash cans first, well, you're going to get billions of legal locations for trash cans if there's nothing already placed in the city. And then now that you've placed your 2 trash cans per block, now those other spaces are available for everything else. But yes, you're constantly happening. So we'd be the validating and placing something. Artists would wonder, hey, I did this. Why did it go away? And it's like, because you shouldn't have put it there. So it took a little while for people to understand everything that was happening.
If an artist placed something and its position later became invalid, would the procedural tools automatically replace it, or would they leave it there and flag it up as invalid?
It depended on what it was. So that's the thing. We don't want to delete something unless we're sure it's never going to work, because we want otherwise you'll be deleting lots of stuff, and then the game will feel empty. And then as far as nudging stuff into the proper location, that's what we want to try to do first. So we're going to maintain the density that art or the procedural system was looking for. So we try to nudge it into place, and then if we can't nudge it into a place that we know is appropriate, then it'll also get flagged and marked.
So it sounds like a lot of your artists and level designers were interfacing with things directly in your editor as opposed to in Houdini when they're going and moving things around.
Yes.
So how much was there a need for you to be able to see the city with the buildings and the approximations in Houdini as well, or was that mostly just the roads, so you didn't worry about seeing the completed version of things?
No, we could load everything into Houdini, and we would load different approximations of what we needed. So we could always load in the imposter models themselves to give us rough ideas of the buildings. We also had volumetric data for those buildings. We had point clouds for every instance, the point clouds for everything. And then those point clouds, when we read them in, they had bounding box information. So we knew extents. So when you're placing something, we could really just do based on, look, it's a big cloud of points. What's placed there? And then this can't be placed there because he has this volume size. So he has a kind of exclusion area. And that's how it kind of would work through. Mostly with point clouds. And then otherwise kind of simple building geometry that was generated for imposters, or if it was it was a mission space that wasn't being impostered because it's only active at that certain time, we would just load all that in. I mean, come right from the
through your round trip when you would regenerate the procedural data every day, or did you have to manually do some sort of export from your editor to get those point cloud data to Houdini?
Nothing. They didn't have to do anything from the editor. It just read it right from our file formats. Yeah. So that's, the very first things I did when I arrived at Insomniac Games is I have to write all the converters to convert all of the Insomniac scene data and model formats and animation and get it into Houdini, and then be able to write it out again. And then they keep changing it, and I'm never able to catch up. So, but actually I just added additional support for how our models are done for Stormland. So I did that earlier this year because they're generating models and reading in models with Houdini, and they need to have this it's kind of some newer data that we keep stored in our models. So a lot of data interchange. So this is just the imposter system. So the imposters are just low-res models. And so we used Houdini to make those the low-res model for an entire building. So an entire building is made of all those different instance pieces, or we take the lowest LOD, or actually stored in our models, we had some special LODs that only Houdini would see. And then and it would use those, and X-Ray kind of showed this in his lighting talk yesterday as well. But it would take those, combine them into a simple model, a low poly model, and then that's what would get sent to the imposter system, which would then project the appropriate textures onto it. And then that model would get reprocessed, that simple model would get reprocessed and compressed for the imposter atlas and imposter rendering. Crimes. So yeah, there were 29 different crimes that were procedurally placed and 25 vignettes that were procedurally placed. And so this is where the crimes had higher priority of placement than props, because we didn't want to block a crime with a prop that should be there all the time. And the crimes had crazy rules that had to be followed. So things like the jetpack crime, where it's like I want 3 rooftops, each that are within 40 meters of each other and within 20 meters of height from each other, and they each have 64 square meters of combat space. And then I have to be able to connect them with navigation curves and clues from roof to roof, and from those rooftops to the sidewalk or alley that's next to them. And so the system would have to find those all in the world, depending on the priority of the crimes. And different crimes are in different acts, but so each the priority of crime placement would find all those legal places in the city, and then distribute them to the appropriate density. And then go. It would actually process through, and then it's like, okay, for this other crime, now I can't find enough rooftop spaces. So what if we change the priority so the other one will go first, because this one actually found more of this, so you kind of had to figure out what the weighting was, what the priority was in order to get these placed. So that is a pretty tricky problem, kind of a chicken and the egg sort of thing. But based on the weightings and the densities, we ended up populating the world with plenty of crimes, more than 3,000 crimes and more than 3,000 vignettes. So when you actually play the game, there's only one of each type of crime in each. I can't remember exactly how it is. Only a few types of each crime within a certain area of the game. So when you're playing it, those become active. Crimes come in, and if you don't go to them, they go away. But if you actually engage a particular crime in a certain area, that crime won't appear in that area again. So there are lots of crimes that, because they're placed everywhere, that you just never see because you've already completed one of those types. Any other questions? So here's, kind of the crime placement. This is a vignette placement. So what it looks like in the game, it looks like that. So they're arresting. This is an arrest vignette. And then what it looks like when it's placed in the editor are these guys. And so you can see in the background, there's more of those vignettes. So this is, I had an overhead shot of this. You pretty much see all those placed everywhere. So in Houdini, I would actually just see boxes of where, these are these types of crimes and these types of crimes, and I'd see how they overlaid on top of each other, because you want stuff to be in varied spaces, unless it absolutely has to share a space. And then you could mess with, some seeds and stuff or other dependencies to push things away from each other. And then in the editor, I would load it in, and I would see all of these things. And you could not load more than like 2 crime zones at a time, because there's just so much in them. So after these crimes or vignettes were placed, then they would be handcrafted to kind of move people to the appropriate spots on the spaces. So in this case, they would maybe move those thugs closer to a doorway or closer to something where they're being handcuffed or whatever. So for crimes, the same thing happened. So the crimes would get placed out in the world, and then they would be hand modified. But as we got later and later in production and more things changed and more crimes had to be moved around, it was running out of time for them to do all that handwork. So we said, well, let's make the procedural system a little more smarter. And so the procedural system started placing breakables and throwables and spawn points for the crimes. And then we were tagging the stuff that we didn't think was going to work so that it could be hand modified. And then what we did with a lot of things is we put them in an inactive state, so it wouldn't spawn or wouldn't build unless somebody actually went through and they said, yep, this is good. So if you actually look at some of these crimes with breakables and throwables where they're like on a crowded rooftop, there'll be a pile of stuff right in the middle of the crime that I couldn't figure out where to place it because I'd already placed a bunch of other stuff. So it just sits right there in the center of the crime, but it doesn't build or into the game. But if a designer went through and played a crime and said, hey, there weren't enough things in that crime, they could go through and say, oh, these guys are left, and they could move it to an appropriate location. So this is my finishing up slide. So Houdini was magic, and it's a critical part of our original plan, and it was vital to all the new challenges, and every department relied on it, including animation, but they didn't even know about it. What they don't know doesn't hurt them. Yeah, you should, if you don't have procedural systems in your projects, you should see how you can get them onto yours. Get it to help your project out. And thank you for coming.